Where am I? The doctor looked at him for a moment before answering. You're in the hospital. The man nodded slowly, as if trying to settle into the answer. His eyes moved across the room, taking in the details, the window, the machines, the quiet stillness. A few seconds passed. Then he looked back again. Where am I? This time, the doctor didn't respond immediately, because something about that moment had already happened. MedLore presents The Man Who Couldn't Make New Memories. In the early 1980s in England, the life of Clive Waring was built around music in a way that few people ever experience. It wasn't just a profession or a skill, it was the structure through which he understood the world. Rhythm, timing, memory, repetition, everything in his life followed patterns that made sense to him. He had been born in Birmingham in 1938, one of 3 siblings, and grew up during a time when the world itself felt uncertain. Years later, after his illness, he would still recall fragments from that distant past, memories of wartime skies, of doodlebugs falling during the Second World War. These weren't clear, continuous recollections, but they existed in pieces, suggesting that some parts of his past had remained untouched. His education reflected a life shaped by discipline and focus. He studied at King Edward VI School in Aston before moving on to Clare College, Cambridge, where he read music. While there, he spent time attending choral services at King's College Chapel, absorbing not just the sound, but the structure behind it. Music for him was never passive. It was something to be understood, constructed, and lived. That understanding carried into his professional life. He joined the London Sinfonietta, working as a chorus master, building a career that required precision, memory, and deep concentration. Every performance depended on timing. Every composition relied on remembering what came before and anticipating what came next. It was a life that depended completely on memory. The first signs that something was wrong were not dramatic. There was no single moment that marked a clear beginning. Instead, it was a gradual shift, small interruptions in a system that had always worked seamlessly. He became distracted more easily. Conversations would drift. He would pause mid-sentence, searching for something that had just been there. "Did I already say that?" he asked once, almost casually. It didn't seem alarming at the time. Fatigue, perhaps, stress, the kind of explanation people reach for when something feels slightly off, but not yet serious. But the interruptions didn't stop. They became more frequent, more noticeable, and then, slowly, they began to change. By the time he was admitted to the hospital, the nature of the problem had shifted entirely. It was no longer about forgetting details. It was about losing orientation itself. When a doctor asked him where he was, he looked around carefully, as if trying to piece the answer together from what he could see. There was a bed, a window, a machine beside him. "I don't know," he said. "You're in a hospital," the doctor replied. Clive nodded, absorbing the information. For a brief moment, it seemed to settle. Then, not long after, he looked up again. "Where am I?" There was no recognition in the question, no sense that it had just been answered. It wasn't confusion in the usual sense. It was absence. As the pattern repeated, the doctors began to understand that this was something deeper than disorientation. The gap between experience and memory had widened to the point where it no longer functioned. Tests were conducted methodically, blood work, neurological examinations, imaging, each step narrowing the possibilities, each result pointing towards something affecting the brain itself. The cause, when it became clear, was both familiar and devastating. A viral infection had spread into his brain, leading to encephalitis. It wasn't the presence of the virus alone that caused the damage, but where that damage had occurred. Certain regions had been affected more than others. Among them was the hippocampus, a structure small in size but essential in function. This is where memory begins. Not the memories you recall from years ago, but the ones forming right now in real time. Every experience passes through this system. A voice you hear, a sentence you understand, a face you recognize, your brain processes it, organizes it, and stores it. That process happens continuously, without effort, creating the sense that time is moving forward in a connected way. In Clive's case, that process had been interrupted. The experiences were still happening. He could see, hear, and respond, but nothing moved beyond the present moment. Nothing was stored. Time, as a result, began to lose its continuity. It didn't slow down or speed up. It simply stopped connecting. A nurse would greet him in the morning, and he would respond naturally. The exchange would feel complete, but within moments it would repeat, not as a continuation, but as if it were happening for the first time again. There was no awareness of repetition, only the present. And yet, not everything had been erased. That was what made the situation so difficult to understand. When he was placed in front of a piano, something remarkable happened. His hands moved with confidence, finding the keys without hesitation. The music that followed was structured, controlled, emotionally intact. It wasn't random, it was precise, the kind of performance that required years of training. But when the music stopped, the connection ended with it. He would look around, disoriented once again. Where am I? The contrast revealed something important. Memory is not a single system. What Clive had lost was the ability to form new conscious memories, the kind that allow you to remember what just happened. But other forms of memory, particularly those tied to learned skills, remained intact. The knowledge of how to play had been preserved, but the experience of playing could not be remembered. His wife's visits brought out another layer of this condition. When she entered the room, he would often react with immediate emotion. There was recognition there, not in the form of a clear memory, but as something deeper, more instinctive. He would hold her tightly, as if reconnecting after a long absence, but that moment would not last. Within minutes, sometimes seconds, the recognition would fade, and the question would return. To try and understand his own experience, Clive began writing in a journal. The entries were brief but consistent. Each one carried the same message, written with urgency. I am awake for the first time. I am conscious now. I am finally aware. Each line reflected a beginning, not because he intended to repeat himself, but because for him, each moment truly felt like the start. We rarely think about how memory shapes our experience of time. It allows one moment to lead into the next, creating continuity, meaning, and identity. Without it, experiences don't accumulate, they disappear. That is what makes conditions like this so profound. They don't simply remove memory, they remove the connection between moments. Clive's past was not entirely gone. Fragments remained, pieces of identity, language, skill, enough to function in certain ways, enough to respond emotionally, enough to recognize patterns like music. But the present could never move forward, and without that forward movement, time itself becomes something else entirely. Not a line, not a sequence, but a series of isolated moments, each one standing alone.
If you find stories like this compelling, real cases that reveal how fragile and complex the human brain truly is, consider following MedLore, because sometimes the most profound medical conditions aren't visible on the surface. They exist quietly, changing the way a person experiences reality itself. And in Clive's case, reality was something that could never quite stay. Thanks for tuning in to MedLore. Stay safe.